What happens when a wedding looks perfect in photos, but the truth lives in a back hallway no one was meant to see? 2 days after my son's wedding, a restaurant manager asked me to come alone and stay silent. That call ended a marriage before the thank you cards were written. The reception hall glowed with amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections from the chandeliers overhead. Everything looked exactly as it should. White linens pressed to perfection, centerpieces arranged with military precision, guests laughing at tables arranged in careful circles around the dance floor. My son Rowan stood near the head table, his arm around Marlene, both of them radiant in that way newlyweds are supposed to be. I should have felt proud. I should have felt complete. Instead, I found myself watching the edges of things, the spaces between the perfect moments where something felt slightly off. Mr. Kelrin, the venue coordinator, appeared at my elbow, clipboard in hand. We need to settle the remaining balance. I nodded, pulling out my wallet. This wasn't unexpected. I'd been covering the wedding expenses piece by piece for months, a fact that Marlene seemed to take for granted and Rowan preferred not to discuss. The coordinator led me to a quiet corner where I signed the final papers and handed over my credit card. "Beautiful ceremony," she said as we waited for the payment to process. "Your daughter-in-law certainly has strong opinions about how things should be handled." There was something in her tone, not quite criticism, but not quite approval either. I looked back toward the gift table, where Marlene was directing 2 staff members with animated gestures. "The gifts need to be moved," Marlene was saying, her voice carrying over the music. "Somewhere more secure, out of sight." One of the staff members, a young woman with tired eyes, gestured toward the designated gift area. "Ma'am, they're perfectly safe here. We have someone—" I said out of sight. Marlene's smile never wavered, but her voice carried an edge that made the staff member step back. "The back hallway will be fine. I'll handle the organization myself." Rowan appeared beside her, looking slightly confused. "Babe, is everything okay?" "Just making sure our gifts are properly cared for," Marlene said, her tone immediately softening. "You know how important it is that everything is perfect." I watched as the staff began moving boxes and envelopes toward a hallway behind the main reception area. Marlene followed closely, occasionally stopping to examine certain envelopes more carefully than others. "Interesting system," I murmured to myself. "Boxes versus envelopes, right?" Marlene had somehow appeared beside me, her laugh bright and musical. "You can always tell who really knows us by what they choose." There was something in the way she said it, a calculating quality that made me look at her more carefully. But before I could respond, she was already moving away, following the last of the gift carriers toward the back hallway. "Dad, you look serious." Rowan joined me, loosening his tie slightly. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I said. "It's been a long day." "Tell me about it." He grinned, but there was something strained around his eyes. "Marlene's been pretty stressed about making sure everything goes perfectly. I think she's worried about disappointing you." I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but Rowan was already being pulled away by a group of his college friends, and I found myself alone again, watching the empty gift table and wondering why moving presents to a back hallway felt like watching something important disappear. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of speeches and dancing, but I found myself checking my watch more frequently than usual. When I finally made my excuses and headed home, I felt relief more than satisfaction. Back in my kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, looking out at the dark backyard. The house felt too quiet after the noise of the reception. I washed the glass carefully, dried it, put it away. Normal actions that felt somehow significant after a day that was supposed to be extraordinary. My phone buzzed with a text from Rowan. "Thanks for everything today, Dad. Couldn't have done it without you." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Happy to help. Get some rest." But as I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, I couldn't shake the image of Marlene examining those envelopes, or the way she'd insisted on handling the gifts herself. It was probably nothing. Wedding stress made people act strangely, but something about her tone when she'd mentioned boxes versus envelopes stuck with me, like a song you can't quite remember, but can't quite forget. I fell asleep thinking about hallways and the things that happen in them when no one is watching. 2 days later, I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Kellren, this is Aaron Blake from Riverside Manor. I was the event manager for your son's wedding." I remembered him. A precise man in his 40s who had handled the evening's logistics with quiet efficiency. "Is there a problem with the final billing?" I asked. "No, sir, nothing like that." There was a pause, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "I need to speak with you about something that happened during the reception. Could you come in? And Mr. Kellren, I'd prefer if you came alone." The tone of his voice made me put the car in drive without asking any more questions. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Riverside Manor looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less magical. Aaron Blake met me at the service entrance and led me through a maze of corridors I hadn't seen during the wedding. His office was cramped and practical, filled with filing cabinets and event schedules pinned to corkboards. "Coffee?" he offered, but I shook my head. "What's this about, Mr. Blake?" He sat down behind his desk, opened a laptop, and turned it toward me. "Aaron, please. And I'm going to show you something that my staff flagged after the wedding. I want you to understand that we take the security of our guests' property very seriously." The laptop screen showed a black and white security feed. I could see the back hallway where the gifts had been moved, timestamp showing 9:47 p.m. "This is about an hour after the gifts were relocated," Aaron said. "Watch carefully." On the screen, I saw Marlene enter the hallway alone. She looked around, then approached the table where the envelopes had been stacked. What happened next made my stomach drop. She began opening envelopes systematically, quickly, but carefully. When she found cash, she removed it and slipped it into a small purse she was carrying. The empty envelopes went into a separate pile. "Keep watching," Aaron said quietly. One of his staff members appeared in the hallway, the same young woman who had tried to explain the security procedures earlier. "Can I help you with anything, ma'am?" I could read her lips even without sound. Marlene's body language changed instantly. She stepped away from the table, her posture becoming defensive. "I'm just organizing things, making sure everything is properly sorted. We can handle that for you. It's really not necessary." I said I can handle it. Even without audio, Marlene's irritation was clear. The staff member hesitated, then backed away. Marlene waited until she was gone, then returned to the envelopes. Aaron fast-forwarded the footage. This goes on for another 23 minutes. She opened every envelope that felt like it might contain cash. "What about the gifts that weren't cash?" Aaron's expression darkened. "That's the part that really bothered my staff." He clicked to another timestamp. On screen, Marlene was going through the boxed gifts, reading cards, examining contents. Several items, picture frames, decorative objects, anything that looked inexpensive, were placed in what appeared to be trash bags. She threw away gifts? Not threw away exactly, but separated them in a way that suggested they weren't worth keeping. Aaron paused the video. "Mr. Kellren, in 15 years of managing events, I've never seen anything like this. The systematic nature of it, the way she waited until staff were occupied elsewhere. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned." I stared at the frozen image on the screen. My new daughter-in-law, caught in the act of sorting through wedding gifts like she was evaluating inventory. "How much cash are we talking about?" Based on what we observed, and counting the envelopes she opened, I'd estimate somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. This wasn't desperation or a moment of weakness. This was theft, carried out methodically while her new husband danced with wedding guests 30 feet away. "There's more," Aaron said, "and it doesn't get better." He showed me another segment of footage. Marlene returning to the hallway multiple times throughout the evening, each time checking to see if new gifts had been added to the table. She had a system, a way of testing envelopes to determine their contents, a method for quickly extracting cash without completely destroying the envelopes. "My staff started paying attention after the first incident," Aaron explained. "They were uncomfortable, but she was the bride, and they weren't sure how to handle it. By the end of the evening, 3 different employees had witnessed this behavior." I sat back in the chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. "Why are you telling me this? Why not Rowan?" Aaron was quiet for a moment. "Because you paid for the wedding, Mr. Kelren. Because my staff said you seemed like someone who would want to know the truth. And because—" he hesitated. "Because that young man looked genuinely happy, and someone needs to protect him from what's coming." "What's coming?" "The kind of person who steals cash from their own wedding gifts. Doesn't stop there. This is who she is, Mr. Kelren. The question is, what you're going to do about it." I stared at the paused video screen, at the image of Marlene carefully extracting bills from an envelope that someone had probably spent time selecting, filling out, sealing with hopes for the couple's future. "I need copies of this footage," I said. "Already prepared." Aaron handed me a flash drive. "Everything is time-stamped and documented. Mr. Kelren, I hope you'll be careful with this information, but I couldn't let it go unreported." I pocketed the drive and stood up. "Thank you for calling me." "There's one more thing." Aaron's voice stopped me at the door. She asked specifically about whether we keep security footage, and for how long. She wanted to know about our privacy policies. "When?" "During the planning meetings, months ago. Like I said, this wasn't impulsive." I drove home in silence, the flash drive feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in my pocket. At red lights, I found myself staring at other drivers, wondering if they could see the truth written on my face, that I'd just watched my son's marriage end before it had really begun. The question wasn't whether to tell Rowan. The question was how to tell him in a way that wouldn't destroy him completely. That night, I sat in my home office with the door closed, staring at the flash drive Aaron had given me. I'd watched the footage 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood something, hoping there was an innocent explanation that had somehow escaped me. There wasn't. But as I sat there, other memories began surfacing. Small moments from the past year that I'd dismissed or rationalized away. Now they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The first time I'd met Marlene, she'd asked detailed questions about my work, my house, my financial situation. I'd thought she was just being thorough, getting to know Rowan's family. Now I wondered if she'd been conducting an assessment. Then there were the temporary help requests. Always small amounts. Help with rent when her roommate moved out unexpectedly. Assistance with a car repair when her insurance didn't cover everything. A loan for textbooks when her financial aid was delayed. Each request came with a detailed explanation and a promise to pay me back quickly. I'd never been repaid. When I'd mentioned it to Rowan, he'd looked embarrassed and said Marlene was still getting on her feet financially, that it wasn't worth making an issue over a few $100s here and there. A few $100s that had added up to nearly $3,000 over the course of their relationship. I opened my laptop and began going through my banking records, creating a spreadsheet of every payment I'd made related to Rowan and Marlene. Wedding venue, catering, flowers, photography, her emergency requests. The total was staggering. Over $20,000 in the past 18 months. Not once had Marlene thanked me directly. Every expression of gratitude had come through Rowan, as if I were some distant benefactor rather than family. I remembered the engagement party when Marlene had insisted on a specific restaurant that was far beyond Rowan's budget. When I'd quietly picked up the check, she'd barely acknowledged it. But later, I'd overheard her telling her friends about the amazing dinner, describing details about the food and wine as if she'd chosen and paid for everything herself. There was the time Rowan had mentioned wanting to take Marlene on a weekend trip for her birthday, but being short on funds. I'd given him $500, thinking it would be a nice gesture. Later, I'd seen Marlene's social media posts from that weekend, photos of expensive dinners, designer shopping bags, spa treatments. The captions talked about how blessed she felt and how generous life had been to her. No mention of Rowan. No mention of where the money had actually come from. I thought about the wedding planning meetings, how Marlene had gradually taken control of every decision while somehow ensuring that all the bills came to me. She'd developed a system. She would discuss options with Rowan, Rowan would mention them to me, and I would end up paying for whatever Marlene had already decided she wanted. It was manipulation so smooth and systematic that I'd barely noticed it happening. My phone buzzed with a text from Rowan. "Hey Dad, Marlene and I are looking at apartments. Found a great place but need help with the security deposit. Could we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding, "Let's talk soon." But not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. I opened a new document and began writing down everything I could remember. Every request, every payment, every moment when Marlene had managed to position herself to benefit from my relationship with Rowan. The pattern that emerged was breathtaking in its consistency. She had been working me from the beginning, and she'd been doing it through my own son. The worst part was how effectively she'd isolated Rowan from the financial realities of their relationship. He genuinely didn't seem to know how much I'd been contributing to their life together. When he thanked me for helping with the wedding, his gratitude was real, but it was also incomplete. He had no idea that I'd paid for almost everything. I pulled up Marlene's social media accounts, scrolling through months of posts. The images told a story of a young woman living well beyond any reasonable means: designer clothes, expensive restaurants, weekend trips, luxury beauty treatments. But the captions were carefully crafted to suggest that these things just happened to her, as if good fortune was constantly falling into her lap. There were very few photos of Rowan in these posts. When he did appear, it was usually in group settings or casual moments. The expensive experiences, the luxury items, those she posed with alone, as if they were the result of her own success rather than my financial support channeled through my son. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also circumstantial. The wedding footage was different. That was clear, documented proof of theft. But everything else was a pattern of manipulation that would be difficult to explain to Rowan without sounding paranoid or controlling, and that, I realized, was probably intentional. Marlene had been careful to structure their relationship so that any criticism of her behavior would look like an attack on Rowan's judgment or his independence. She'd made herself indispensable to his happiness while making me the invisible source of their financial stability. It was brilliant, in a sociopathic kind of way. My calendar alert chimed, "Final wedding invoice settlement, tomorrow." I'd forgotten about the outstanding vendor payments. There were still a few $1,000s in bills that hadn't been processed yet. The photographer's balance, final catering adjustments, service fees. All of it contracted under my name, all of it my responsibility. But as I looked at the contracts I'd signed, I noticed something interesting. The payment structure allowed for expense reassignment under certain circumstances. If I could demonstrate that the services had been compromised or that there had been fraud related to the event, I could potentially restructure who was legally responsible for the costs. It was a long shot, but the wedding footage might qualify as evidence of fraud. And if Marlene had systematically stolen cash gifts from the wedding I'd paid for, there might be legal grounds for holding her financially accountable. I made a note to call my lawyer in the morning, not to attack Marlene, but to protect myself and ultimately to protect Rowan from whatever financial damage she might cause in the future. Because if she was willing to steal from her own wedding gifts, systematically and without remorse, what would she be willing to do once she had access to Rowan's bank accounts, his credit, his future earnings? I turned off the office light and headed upstairs, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the footage, about Marlene's careful, methodical movements as she sorted through envelopes and evaluated gifts like inventory. But mostly, I thought about Rowan's face during the wedding, genuinely happy, completely trusting, utterly unaware that his new wife was stealing from their guests while he danced and celebrated 30 feet away. Someone had to protect him, and it looked like that someone was going to be me. The next morning, I called Cedric Price, the family lawyer who had handled my divorce and estate planning for the past decade. Cedric was methodical, unemotional, and excellent at finding solutions to complicated problems without creating unnecessary drama. "I need to see you today," I told him. "It's about Rowan's wedding, and it's urgent." "How urgent?" "The kind that involves potential fraud and needs to be handled before anyone realizes what I'm doing." Cedric's office was downtown, in one of those glass buildings that made everything inside feel serious and permanent. I brought the flash drive, my financial records, and copies of all the wedding contracts. "Show me what you have," Cedric said, settling behind his desk with a legal pad. I started with the footage. Cedric watched it twice, making notes about timestamps and specific actions. His expression never changed, but I saw him write "systematic theft" and underline it. "How much cash are we estimating?" he asked. "Between $2,000 and $3,000, based on the restaurant manager's assessment." "And you paid for the wedding?" "Almost entirely. $23,000 in total costs." Cedric reviewed the contracts I'd signed. "These are interesting. You have payment responsibility, but you also have certain rights regarding vendor relationships and event security. The venue has an obligation to protect guest property, which they failed to do." "What does that mean legally?" "It means you have grounds to reassign financial responsibility for the event to the person who committed fraud during it." Cedric looked up from the contracts. "Felix, if you pursue this, it won't be quiet. This kind of reassignment requires documentation, evidence, and formal proceedings." "What if I don't pursue it legally, but just want to be prepared?" Cedric leaned back in his chair. "You want to have the option without committing to it yet." "Exactly." "That's smart. We can prepare everything, document the evidence, structure the financial reassignment, get all the paperwork ready. Then you decide if and when to use it." He made more notes. "I'll need sworn statements from the restaurant staff who witnessed the theft, official copies of the security footage, and documentation of all your payments related to the wedding." "How long will that take?" "If we move quickly, everything can be ready by the end of the week. But Felix, once this is prepared, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. This kind of evidence can destroy relationships permanently." "The relationship is already destroyed," I said. "The question is whether my son realizes it yet." After leaving Cedric's office, I drove to my bank. I'd been thinking about the pattern of financial requests from Marlene, and I wanted to understand exactly how much money had flowed from my accounts to support their lifestyle. My banker, Patricia, had known me for 15 years. When I explained that I needed detailed records of all transfers and payments related to my son and his wife, she didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Going back how far?" she asked. 2 years. Everything." The printouts were sobering. In 24 months, I'd transferred or paid nearly $35,000 that had directly or indirectly benefited Marlene. The wedding was the largest single expense, but the pattern of smaller payments was just as revealing. "Patricia, I need to set up a structured transfer system," I said. "Something that allows me to redirect financial responsibility for certain expenses if specific conditions are met." "Like what kind of conditions?" "Legal findings of fraud or theft." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. We can structure that. It would essentially be a conditional reassignment of debt, triggered by documented legal evidence. How quickly could something like that be implemented? If you have the legal documentation, we could have it in place within 48 hours. I left the bank with a folder full of financial records and a sick feeling in my stomach. The numbers were worse than I'd thought. Marlene hadn't just been taking advantage of my generosity. She'd been systematically extracting money from me for 2 years, using Rowan as an unwitting intermediary. That evening, I called Aaron Blake at the restaurant. "Mr. Kellren, I was hoping I'd hear from you. I need to ask you about preserving the security footage. How long do you normally keep recordings?" "Standard policy is 90 days, but given the circumstances, I've already archived the relevant footage separately. It's not going anywhere." "What about your staff? The ones who witnessed what happened?" "They're willing to provide statements if needed. They were pretty disturbed by what they saw." Aaron paused. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" "I'm preparing options," I said. "But I need to ask you to keep this completely confidential for now." "Of course. But Mr. Kellren, you should know that your daughter-in-law called here yesterday." A sudden chill ran through me. What did she want? She said she thought she might have left something in the back hallway during the reception. Wanted to know if we'd found any personal items, if we'd reviewed any footage of that area. "What did you tell her?" "That we hadn't found anything, and that our security footage was routine and confidential. But she was very persistent about whether we'd noticed anything unusual." Marlene was checking to see if she'd been caught, which meant she knew exactly what she'd done, and she was worried about the evidence. "Aaron, I need you to document that phone call. Date, time, exactly what she said." "Already done. I had a feeling it might be important." After hanging up, I sat in my car for a long time, thinking about what Marlene's call to the restaurant meant. She wasn't just a thief, she was a careful thief, someone who planned ahead and covered her tracks. The fact that she was already checking on potential evidence meant she understood the legal implications of what she'd done. It also meant she was probably preparing her own defenses. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through Rowan's recent social media posts. He'd been sharing photos from their honeymoon, a weekend trip to a resort that I knew he couldn't afford. The images showed expensive dinners, spa treatments, luxury accommodations. The resort charged at least $400 a night. Rowan made $35,000 a year at his entry-level job. There was no way he was paying for this trip, which meant either Marlene had money I didn't know about, or they were going into debt to maintain an image of prosperity, or she was using the cash she'd stolen from their wedding gifts. I started the car and drove home, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. Marlene wasn't just manipulative, she was strategic. She'd been working a long-term plan, using Rowan to access my resources while building a lifestyle that was completely unsustainable. The wedding theft wasn't an aberration. It was just the most visible part of a much larger pattern, and now she was trying to find out if anyone had noticed. For the next 3 days, I did nothing. I didn't call Rowan, didn't respond to Marlene's friend request on social media, didn't react when Rowan texted me photos from their honeymoon. I maintained complete normalcy while Cedric prepared the legal documentation and the bank set up the conditional transfer protocols. It was the hardest 3 days I'd ever experienced. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from Rowan, I felt the weight of what I knew pressing against what I wanted to believe. He was still in that honeymoon phase where everything felt perfect and permanent. His texts were full of excitement about their future, gratitude for the wedding, plans for the life they were going to build together. He had no idea that his wife had stolen from their guests, or that she'd been systematically extracting money from his father for 2 years. On Thursday evening, Cedric called with an update. "Everything is prepared," he said. "We have sworn statements from 3 restaurant employees, certified copies of the security footage, complete financial documentation of your wedding expenses, and a legal framework for reassigning financial responsibility based on fraud." "What does that mean in practical terms?" It means that if you choose to proceed, Marlene becomes legally responsible for the full cost of the wedding, $23,000. The evidence is solid enough that any court would uphold the reassignment. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. And if I don't proceed, then you've paid for a wedding where the bride stole from the guests and there are no consequences for her actions. What about Rowan? How does this affect him legally? Since they're married, her debt becomes their debt. But the fraud occurred before the marriage was consummated, and the theft was from joint property. The wedding gifts belong to both of them legally. A good lawyer could argue that Rowan is as much a victim as anyone else. That night, I re-watched the security footage one more time. I'd been hoping that repeated viewings might reveal some detail I'd missed, some innocent explanation for what I was seeing. Instead, I noticed new details that made everything worse. Marlene's movements were practiced, efficient. She knew exactly how to test an envelope to determine if it contained cash, how to open it without completely destroying it, how to extract money without leaving obvious evidence. This wasn't her first time doing something like this. I also noticed that she checked the hallway entrance frequently, timing her actions around the movements of staff and guests. She had a system for avoiding detection that suggested experience with covert activities. Most disturbing of all, I saw the moment when Rowan appeared in the hallway, looking for her. She immediately stepped away from the gift table, smiled brightly, and kissed him. The transition from calculating thief to loving bride took less than 3 seconds. Rowan had been standing 5 feet away from evidence of his wife's theft, and he'd seen nothing but a woman who was happy to see him. On Friday morning, I made a decision. I called Aaron Blake and asked if I could use the restaurant's private dining room for a family meeting on Sunday afternoon. "Of course," he said. "Should I have the security equipment available?" "Yes. And Aaron, I'll need you and your staff members to be present." "We'll be there." Next, I called Rowan. "Dad!" "Perfect timing. Marlene and I were just talking about having dinner with you soon. We want to show you all our honeymoon photos." The enthusiasm in his voice made my chest tight. "Actually, I was hoping we could meet Sunday afternoon. I have something I need to discuss with both of you." "Sure. What's it about?" "Just some wedding follow-up. Nothing urgent, but it's easier to handle in person." "Sounds good. Should we come to your house?" "Actually, I've reserved a private room at Riverside Manor. I thought it would be nice to go back to where it all happened." Rowan laughed. "Marlene will love that. She's been saying we should have dinner there sometime. She really loved the place." "I bet she did." "Great. 2 o'clock on Sunday? We'll be there." After hanging up, I called Marlene directly. It was the first time I'd spoken to her since the wedding. "Felix, how wonderful to hear from you." Her voice was warm, friendly, completely natural. "Rowan told me about Sunday. I'm so excited. I've been wanting to thank you properly for everything you did for our wedding." "I'm looking forward to it," I said. "There are a few things I'd like to discuss." "Of course. I hope it's not about money. I know we still owe you for some things, and we're planning to start paying you back soon." It was a masterful touch, acknowledging debt while making it sound minor and temporary, positioning herself as responsible and grateful. "We'll talk about everything on Sunday," I said. "Perfect. Should I bring anything? Photos? Thank you cards?" "Just bring yourself. Everything else is already prepared." Saturday night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Rowan's face when he saw the footage, about how his world was going to change in the space of a few minutes. I thought about whether I was doing the right thing, whether there was some other way to handle this that wouldn't devastate him. But every time I considered staying silent, I thought about Marlene's phone call to the restaurant, checking to see if she'd been caught. I thought about the systematic way she'd been extracting money from me, the practiced efficiency of her theft, the complete absence of remorse or guilt. This wasn't going to get better on its own. If anything, it was going to get worse. Rowan deserved to know who he'd married before they had children, before they bought a house together, before she had access to his credit and his future earnings. He deserved to make an informed decision about his life. And Marlene deserved to face consequences for her actions. Sunday morning, I dressed carefully, not formal, but serious. I put the folder of evidence in my briefcase, along with the legal documents Cedric had prepared. I drove to Riverside Manor an hour early and met with Aaron to review the setup. "The private dining room is ready," he said. "We've set up the presentation equipment, and my staff members are here. Are you sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure. It's going to be difficult." "Yes, it is." At 1:55 p.m., I was sitting alone in the private dining room, watching the door and thinking about how quickly a life can change. In 5 minutes, Rowan and Marlene would walk through that door expecting a pleasant family conversation. By the time they left, nothing would ever be the same. At exactly 2 p.m., I heard voices in the hallway. Rowan's laugh, Marlene's bright chatter about how beautiful the restaurant looked in daylight. Aaron appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Kellren, your guests are here." I stood up, straightened my jacket, and prepared to destroy my son's marriage. "Send them in." Rowan entered first, looking relaxed and happy in a casual button-down shirt and khakis. Marlene followed, radiant in a sundress that probably cost more than Rowan made in a week. She'd done her hair and makeup carefully. This was clearly an occasion she'd been looking forward to. "Dad!" Rowan hugged me warmly. "This place looks completely different during the day." Marlene kissed my cheek, her smile brilliant and genuine seeming. "Felix, thank you so much for arranging this. I've been wanting to have a proper conversation with you about everything. Please, sit down." I gestured to the chairs arranged around a small conference table. "I've asked Aaron Blake, the event manager, to join us, along with a few of his staff members." Rowan looked puzzled. "Is there a problem with the final billing or something?" "In a way, yes." Aaron entered with 2 of his staff members, the young woman who had tried to help Marlene with the gifts, and the security supervisor who had first flagged the unusual behavior. They arranged themselves along one wall, their expressions serious and professional. Marlene's smile faltered slightly. "This seems very formal. Is everything okay?" I opened my briefcase and removed the folder of documents. 2 days after your wedding, Aaron called me about some irregularities that his staff had observed during the reception." "What kind of irregularities?" Rowan asked. Instead of answering, I turned to Aaron. "Would you please show them what you showed me?" Aaron moved to the presentation screen and activated the security footage. The timestamp appeared. Wedding night, 9:47 p.m., back hallway. "This is the area where the gifts were relocated during the reception," Aaron said. "We're going to watch approximately 30 minutes of footage from that evening." The screen showed the empty hallway for a few seconds, then Marlene entered the frame. Rowan leaned forward, confused. "Why are we watching security footage of Marlene organizing our gifts?" "Just watch," I said quietly. On screen, Marlene began her systematic examination of the envelopes. The room fell completely silent as she opened the first one, extracted cash, and slipped it into her purse. "What?" Rowan's voice trailed off. Marlene had gone very still, her face pale. "This is a misunderstanding." The footage continued. Envelope after envelope, cash extracted and pocketed, empty envelopes discarded. When the staff member approached to offer help, we all watched Marlene's defensive reaction, her insistence on handling everything herself. "Stop it." Marlene's voice was sharp. "Turn it off." "Keep watching," I said. The footage showed her returning to the hallway multiple times throughout the evening, each time checking for new gifts, each time extracting any cash she found. Her movements were practiced, efficient, completely methodical. Rowan was staring at the screen like he was watching something impossible. "This can't be real." Aaron fast-forwarded to show Marlene sorting through the boxed gifts, separating items into different categories, placing what appeared to be less expensive presents into trash bags. "The total amount of cash we observed being taken was approximately $2,700, Aaron said. This footage spans the entire evening and shows a systematic pattern of theft. It's not theft. Marlene stood up abruptly. Those were our gifts. I was organizing them. By stealing the cash and throwing away presents you didn't want? I asked. I wasn't stealing anything. I was keeping the money safe. There were so many people around, and I was worried about it getting lost. Rowan was still staring at the screen, which now showed a frozen image of his wife pocketing cash from an envelope. Marlene, what is this? It's a misunderstanding, baby. Your father is trying to make something innocent look suspicious. I opened the folder and removed a stack of documents. These are copies of all the payments I made for your wedding. Venue, catering, flowers, photography, music, decorations. The total comes to $23,400. Rowan looked at the invoices with growing confusion. Dad, I know you helped with costs, but this… I paid for everything, Rowan. The entire wedding. That's not true, Marlene said quickly. We contributed… Show me. I placed a bank statement in front of her. Show me one payment you made toward your own wedding. Marlene stared at the documents, her composure finally cracking. We were going to pay you back. With stolen gift money? I didn't steal anything. I removed another set of documents. These are records of every financial request you made over the past 2 years. Emergency rent assistance, car repairs, textbook money, medical bills. The total is $3,400, none of which has been repaid. Rowan was looking between the documents and his wife with growing horror. Marlene, is this true? Your father offered to help. I never asked for anything. Every request came through Rowan, I continued. You never asked me directly, but you made sure Rowan knew about every financial crisis, every emergency that required immediate assistance. I placed the final document on the table. This is a legal reassignment of financial responsibility for your wedding. Based on documented fraud and theft, Marlene is now legally liable for the full cost of the event, $23,400. The room went completely silent. Marlene stared at the legal document like it was written in a foreign language. You can't do this, she whispered. It's already done. The evidence of theft is overwhelming, and the financial documentation is complete. You stole from your own wedding guests while your husband's father paid for everything. Rowan stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need some air. Rowan, wait. Marlene reached for him, but he stepped away. Did you do it? He asked quietly. Did you steal money from our wedding gifts? Marlene looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an escape route. It's not what it looks like. Did you do it? I was trying to protect us. There were so many people, and cash just sitting there, and I thought… You thought you'd steal it. It wasn't stealing. It was our money. Money that people gave to both of us, that you took without telling me. Rowan's voice was getting louder. Money you pocketed while I was thanking guests for their generosity. Rowan, please just listen. I am listening. I'm listening to security footage of my wife systematically robbing our wedding guests. I placed one more document on the table. These are printouts of text messages between you and your friends discussing how to manage Rowan and his family for maximum financial benefit. Marlene's face went white. How did you get those? Your phone automatically backed up to Rowan's cloud account. He gave me access when I was helping him with his computer setup last month. The messages were devastating. Conversations about working the dad angle, strategies for getting money without seeming too obvious, discussions about how much I was good for, financially. There were messages about the wedding planning, with Marlene explicitly stating that she was going to milk this for everything it's worth. Rowan read the messages in complete silence, his expression changing from confusion to hurt to something harder and colder. Was any of it real? He asked finally. Marlene started to cry. Of course it was real. I love you. You love what I can give you, what my family can give you. That's not true. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and removed his wedding ring. He placed it carefully on the table next to the legal documents. "Rowan, don't do this. Please. We can work through this." He stood up, looked at her one more time, then turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Marlene called after him. Rowan paused in the doorway without turning around. "Home, to figure out how to explain to people that my marriage lasted 6 days. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Marlene stared at the ring on the table, then at the documents, then at me. "You planned this. You orchestrated all of this." "I documented it," I said. "You orchestrated it." She gathered her purse and stood up, her composure completely gone. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Aaron and his staff had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, professional witnesses to the end of a marriage that had been doomed from the beginning. After Marlene left, I sat alone in the private dining room, looking at the wedding ring Rowan had left behind. It caught the afternoon light coming through the windows, throwing small rainbows across the legal documents that had just destroyed my son's marriage. I'd done what needed to be done. But as I packed up the evidence and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone involved had lost something important, even if it had never been real to begin with. The hardest part was knowing that Rowan would have to rebuild his entire understanding of love, trust, and judgment. The woman he'd thought he was marrying had never actually existed, but at least now he was free to find someone who did. 6 months later, Rowan moved back to the city and started over. Marlene disappeared, leaving behind $23,000 in debt and a trail of similar schemes in 3 other states. The wedding ring still sits in my desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is show them the truth, even when it destroys everything they thought they wanted. The footage showed everything. The truth did the rest.